The summer of 1839 was different. It wasn't the dry kind of hot that passed with the setting sun, or the brief fury of a thunderstorm. This heat lingered. It pressed down on the Wind River range like a weight, refusing to move, refusing to break. Rivers shrank, the forest stood still, and the mountains themselves seemed to bake in silence. That's when Isaac Coulter first realized something was wrong, not with the weather, which every man complained about, but with his cabin. It wasn't just hot, it was unbearable. And unlike the men who could leave for the trading post or camp beneath the pines to escape it, Isaac was stuck. His cabin, the one he'd spent an entire season building by hand, had become a trap, and that unbearable summer would become the catalyst for a discovery that mountain men would copy for the next 50 years. Isaac had never planned on staying in one place for long. Like most trappers, he'd come west chasing beaver pelts and freedom, not comfort. But by the time he reached the upper tributaries of the Green River in the spring of '37, things had changed. His knee, shattered in a fall 2 winters prior, ached too badly in the snow to keep up with the brigades. He could walk, but long treks over ridges and through icy rivers weren't possible anymore. So he adapted, found a spot tucked into the southern shadow of the Wind Rivers where game was still good. Water ran cold and clear, and the old traplines hadn't been worked in years. He picked a grove of cottonwoods beside a spring and built a cabin, not just a trapping shelter, an actual home. The first winter had been hard, as all winters were, but his cabin held. His fireplace drew clean, his roof never leaked. By spring, he'd even started cutting fir again, slowly, methodically, working smaller streams that required less travel. It wasn't a fortune, but it kept him fed, and the solitude suited him. Until the summer of '39 came. That was when he learned that a cabin that could survive a Wyoming winter might just break a man come July. It started slow, days stretching longer, hotter. By late June, the nights stopped cooling. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick, stagnant. Isaac tried everything. He left the shutters open, slept near the floor, even hauled water inside, hoping the evaporation might lower the temperature. Nothing worked. Some nights he couldn't sleep at all, soaked in sweat, heart racing from the heat. He considered sleeping outside, but the mosquitoes were thick as smoke, and he didn't trust the distant howls he heard after midnight. Worse, his stores were spoiling. Salt pork turned soft in its barrels. Dried meat sweated and soured. His traps rusted from the condensation that soaked everything at nightfall. The turning point came the night the dog died. He'd taken in a mutt 2 seasons earlier, something lean and smart that followed him home from the Green River rendezvous and never left. The dog was strong, built for the cold, but not for this. That night, Isaac found him panting in the corner, tongue lolling, too weak to stand. He set a bucket of water beside him, but the dog didn't move. By dawn, he was stiff, jaw clenched, eyes cloudy with heat stroke. Isaac buried him beneath the cottonwoods and sat for a long time, not speaking, not thinking, just listening to the silence that heat brings, the kind that eats birdsong and wind, and makes even the insects still. And that's when something shifted. Most men would have endured, complained, moved, built another shelter deeper in the pines or higher on the ridge. But Isaac had always been a different breed. He wasn't a genius, wasn't trained in architecture or science, but he paid attention. His mind worked in quiet ways, always chewing on problems, watching, cataloging. And now his cabin had become the problem. Why did it trap heat like a furnace when the nights should have been cool? Why did it feel hotter inside than outside? He started watching how the sun moved across the roof, how the wind died against the logs but moved through the branches. He noticed how the ground, even in mid-afternoon, stayed cool beneath the thickest trees. He touched the walls, on the inside, hot to the palm, on the outside, cooler. He began taking notes, scratch marks on the inside of the shutters, temperature at sunrise, position of the sun at noon, wind direction in the evenings. A week passed, then 2. He stopped trapping, stopped cutting wood. He became obsessed with understanding the heat. There was something about that summer, something cruel in its consistency. Every mistake he'd made in building the cabin was being exposed, slowly and methodically, by nature itself. He saw how the fireplace, unused in summer, now sat like a cold anchor in the middle of the room, retaining none of the cool it should have. He realized the single-room design allowed heat to settle and stay, pooling at the top and radiating down like a low-hanging oven. He understood, too late, that building into a clearing, while beautiful in the winter sun, left him exposed in summer to every hour of daylight, with no natural shade to protect the structure. But Isaac didn't just suffer, he experimented. The first attempt was simple. He shaded the cabin with a crude lean-to built from pine boughs and saplings, creating a false roof suspended 4 feet above the real one. The effect was immediate. The roof, no longer baking in direct sunlight, stopped radiating heat into the room. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a start. Encouraged, he tried more. more. Dug a shallow trench beside the cabin and noticed the air at the bottom stayed cool even at midday. He slept in the trench that night. It was miserable, but tolerable. He began hauling cool rocks from the spring into the cabin at dawn, arranging them in corners to absorb heat. By evening, they were warm to the touch. He reversed the process, took hot stones from inside and left them in the stream. Overnight, then brought them in at dusk. The stones cooled the room for hours. Still, it wasn't enough. The cabin, at its core, was wrong. The walls, thick as they were, trapped heat rather than repelled it. The single room offered no airflow, no place for heat to escape. It was a sealed box, and Isaac had built it that way on purpose. Tight chinking, sealed shutters, no vents. Great for January, deadly in July. That's when the idea hit. Not all at once, but in pieces. A conversation from years ago, back east. A trader had mentioned the cliff dwellings of the Anasazi, how they stayed cool even in desert summers, built into stone, shaded, high and dry. And then another memory. An old trapper, long since dead, had once mentioned a trick the Navajo used. Air shafts dug into the earth, channeling cool air into hogans during the heat of day. At the time, Isaac had dismissed it as campfire nonsense. Now, it felt like revelation. He began digging. It wasn't much at first. A narrow shaft angled down from the north side of the cabin, away from the sun. He dug it 4 feet deep, then turned the angle sharply so the final stretch ran horizontally beneath the floor. He lined it with stone, packed it with moss, and left the exit point open beneath his cot. When he lay down that night, he could feel it, a faint whisper of cool air rising from the shaft, touching his back like the breath of the forest itself. It wasn't strong, but it was consistent. It didn't depend on fire or wind or sun. It just worked. From there, the real construction began. Isaac tore out part of the floor and began redesigning the entire understructure. He added a second shaft on the opposite side, creating a passive airflow from one end of the cabin to the other. He carved small vents high in the south wall, hidden beneath the eaves, allowing heat to rise and escape. He reinforced the lean-to roof, turning it into a full-shade canopy with gaps for air to circulate. He even built an earthen shelf along the north wall, packed with stones from the stream, each one rotated daily. Warm stones out, cool stones in. By mid-August, the change was undeniable. Inside the cabin, it was nearly 20 degrees cooler than outside at midday. At night, the heat bled off naturally, allowing him to sleep without sweat-soaked linens. His salt pork stopped spoiling, his dried meat held firm. He'd found balance, not by fighting the heat, but by learning how it moved and working with it. But the discovery wouldn't stay secret for long, because that same summer, a small band of traders passed through the Wind River Valley. One of them, an older man named Louis Harper, came down with heat sickness after a week on the trail. Isaac took him in, let him recover inside the cool cabin, and by the second day, Harper noticed. He ran his hand along the wall, touched the cool stones, and asked the question that would echo through every trapping camp in the Rockies by the following year. How the hell is it cooler in here than it is outside? Isaac just smiled. Harper wasn't the kind of man who missed details. He'd been in the fur trade since the 20s, seen every kind of cabin, from the Appalachians to the Bitterroots. He knew what summer meant in the high country, sweat-drenched nights, meat that spoiled no matter how it was packed, water that tasted like warm tin after noon. So when he woke up in Isaac Coulter's cabin after 2 days of fever and found himself cool, comfortable, and breathing air that didn't feel like soup, he knew something was off. Not wrong, just unusual. And in the mountains, unusual could be the difference between life and death. He started asking questions. What wood was used? Where was the stream? Why was there no smoke despite the fireplace being cold? He ran his fingers along the floorboards, tapped the walls, studied the corners. Isaac didn't say much. He wasn't a secretive man, not by nature, but he didn't trust curiosity, not from strangers. Still, Harper had a way about him. He didn't push, didn't pry, just observed, asked short questions, and let the silence do the heavy lifting. By the time the traders moved on 2 days later, Harper had seen enough to understand that something new had happened in that cabin. He didn't know how the airflow worked exactly, or why the temperature held steady even during the peak heat, but he understood one thing perfectly. Isaac had solved a problem that every man in the Rockies faced, and he'd done it without ice, without springs, without magic, just design, and that meant the idea had value. Word spread slowly at first. Harper mentioned the cool trapper's hut at the next trading post. Another man who'd stopped through the Wind River mentioned it again at Fort Bridger. By early fall, a trapper from the Snake River Basin came looking for Isaac, saying he'd heard about the man who tamed the summer heat. Isaac wasn't trying to make a name for himself, but the name was making its way through the mountains just the same. Men came curious, some skeptical, others desperate. And Isaac, still quiet, still wary, started showing them what he'd done. Not out of pride, but out of something else, something closer to duty, because by then, he'd realized this wasn't just about comfort. In late September, a young trapper from the Winter Range arrived half-starved, sunburned, and shaken. His partner had died of dehydration 3 weeks earlier after they tried to hike out of a heat pocket too fast without proper shade. The survivor had heard, secondhand, about a trapper with a cold cabin and had walked nearly 70 miles through high country to find him. Isaac took him in, fed him broth, let him sleep on the cool floor, and when the young man finally spoke, it wasn't with grief, it was with awe. "It feels like you bottled the night," Isaac didn't reply. But something changed in him that day. The experiment had become a mission. He started refining the system, making it simpler, easier to replicate. Not every trapper had access to stone or the strength to dig shafts, so he began experimenting with alternatives. Ventilation flaps made from hide, weighted chimney dampers carved from scrap timber, earthen jars of water placed strategically to create evaporative cooling. He sketched diagrams on bark, carved rough blueprints into planks. The cabin became a living model, a place where theory met wilderness, where every improvement could be tested in real time. What he discovered went beyond passive airflow. He found that even the smell of the cabin changed when airflow was right. No mildew, no sour rot. He noticed that gear stored near the air shafts dried faster but didn't crack. That bread stayed longer in canvas wrap than in sealed tins if placed beside the north wall stones. Every inch of the cabin began to serve a function, not just structural, but climatic. The structure had become a kind of organism, responding to heat, shifting temperature internally without fire or smoke. By October, the high country began to whisper of snow, and most trappers drifted back down toward lower elevations. Isaac stayed, of course, but that fall, he wasn't alone for long. 3 men from the Yellowstone Fork showed up before the first frost, asking if he'd teach them how to build what he'd built. They weren't greenhorns. They were seasoned, tired, and looking to stay in one place longer. They had furs, supplies, tools, but no knowledge of airflow or thermal mass. Isaac agreed, not because they had anything he wanted, but because he saw the future in them. If these men could build cold cabins, they could teach others. The idea would move beyond the Wind River shadows. So he walked them through the design, step by step. How to dig the earth shafts, angle, depth, placement, how to create the second roof layer for shade, how to build a chimney that pulled heat out and held cool air in. He explained materials, how moss behaved differently when dry or wet, how stone cooled faster than wood but held temperature longer, how bark thatched in layers could trap heat or repel it depending on direction. They listened, took notes in charcoal on tanned hide, and when the snows came they left, not southward but toward a ridge 2 valleys over, where they started construction on what would become the first cold cabin built from Isaac's system by other hands. The change came fast after that. By spring, reports were coming in from as far north as the Madison. Cabins with vent shafts, shade canopies, men reporting cool interiors even during midday. The designs weren't always perfect. Some shafts collapsed, some airflows failed, but the principle was there. The knowledge had taken root, but so had something else. A problem Isaac hadn't anticipated. As his ideas spread, so did the misinterpretations. Traders started calling it the Iceless House. Some even claimed Isaac had discovered a mineral that cooled the air, or hidden some mountain spring under his floor. Others believed he'd found some ancient native trick long lost to the white man. A few began arriving just to dig, hoping to find the secret hidden beneath the floorboards. The worst was a man named Redford. He was a former army scout turned trader, always looking for the next profitable venture. When he arrived that summer, he didn't knock, just barged in, started poking, prodding, asking pointed questions. Isaac didn't like him. Redford had eyes like a banker, always counting, and he didn't want to learn. He wanted to claim. "I could build 50 of these," he said, after an hour of stomping through the cabin. "Hell, set up a summer camp for army men. Charge a fee. Ain't no law says cold air's yours to keep." Isaac didn't answer. He just watched the man, the way his fingers lingered on corners, the way he took notes in his head. Redford left that evening, but 2 weeks later another man came, clearly sent by him, asking technical questions, drawing diagrams. Isaac stopped talking then, stopped showing, because it had become clear someone was going to try and turn survival into a commodity. That fall, a structure appeared near the base of the Green River Trail. Large, 2 rooms, a heavy canvas roof stretched on poles, air vents, a shade trench, and outside a sign, "Cool Lodging, 2 bits a night." Isaac heard about it from a young trapper who passed through in October. He didn't say much when he heard, but his hands shook when he chopped wood that evening, and his fire burned long past midnight, because something sacred had been twisted. What began as necessity, what grew through desperation, trial, and buried dogs, had become a thing to be sold, and that realization began to darken the edges of Isaac's mind. Not anger, not yet, but something colder. He knew the mountains gave knowledge at a price, and now men were stealing it without paying their share in in blood, sweat, or silence. Still, he said nothing, not for now, because winter was coming. And he had a new idea, one that would take everything he'd learned, everything he'd built, and turn it into something the mountains themselves might recognize, something that could not be copied with canvas and poles. He would build the final cabin, not for comfort, not for profit, but as proof. Isaac Coulter woke before dawn that first morning of winter, knowing it would be the last season he spent in his current cabin. Snow had dusted the valley floor overnight, thin as ash, but enough to mark the transition. The fire burned low in the hearth, and the stone benches still gave off the last of their stored heat. He dressed slowly, not from laziness but thoughtfulness. Today he would begin again. He packed only what he needed: tools, a bedroll, a small bag of dried meat, and his design journal, a thick slab of pressed bark wrapped in oilskin, filled with hand-sketched diagrams, and notes carved in charcoal and grease pencil. Everything else, pots, trade goods, leftover hides, he left where they were. The cabin wasn't being abandoned. It was being honored, left intact as the prototype it was. The site for the new cabin had taken him 2 weeks to find. He scouted it late in the fall, traveling high along a ridge south of the spring, past where most trappers ventured. The elevation was harsher, wind cut deeper, snow lingered longer, but the land was drier, and the trees grew tighter together. More importantly, a sandstone outcrop jutted from the base of the ridge, forming a natural U-shape with a hollowed pocket at its center. The rock faced north, the cold direction, and cast a permanent shadow across the clearing for most of the day. Beneath it, the ground stayed cool year-round. Even in August, the moss here stayed damp. Isaac had tested it himself, pressing his hand into the stone shelf at noon, and finding it cold as spring water. That place, he decided, would be the heart of the final cabin. The first weeks of work were brutal. Isaac labored alone, breaking earth through frostbitten soil with an iron pick, hauling loose stone from the stream and dragging deadfall up the ridge on a makeshift sledge. His knee ached with every trip, but he ignored it. He'd grown used to pain. Winter slowed him, but didn't stop him. The days were short, the nights freezing, but the cold worked in his favor. The ground kept its structure, and moisture didn't saturate the foundation. Snow heaped around the site, building natural windbreaks. Each day the foundation took more shape, 2-foot-deep trenches forming a rectangle that would hold the stone base of the structure. This time there would be no floor laid directly on earth. The entire interior would be raised on stone piers and vented on all sides. But that wasn't the real innovation. Isaac had studied the sandstone formation obsessively and realized something strange. The rock absorbed almost no direct sunlight. Its north-facing curve meant it trapped ambient coolness year-round. That meant it was a thermal well, a structure that could be used not just for shelter but for pulling heat out of another space. He devised a system of copper pipe and buried channels, salvaged from broken traps and traded gear, which he laid against the rock's inner face. He planned for the channels to carry warm air from inside the cabin through the rock pocket and back out through a rear exhaust vent high on the ridge. The idea was simple: make heat move the way cold air once had, but in reverse. Use the mountain's own geology as a cooling engine. The cabin itself would be smaller than his first, but denser. The outer walls were built from double layers of stone and debarked pine, packed with a blend of clay, sand, moss, and animal hair. The same mixture he'd perfected before, but this time treated with lye from burned hardwood ash to further bind the sealant. The logs were cut in late fall, seasoned for weeks in a covered stack. He'd taken care to peel every one, not just for structure, but to discourage insects, mold, and heat absorption. Each log was flattened on 2 sides, fitted with tongue and groove joints carved by hand, and stacked with precision that bordered on obsession. This time, there would be no fireplace. Instead, Isaac designed a central stone chamber, round, low-walled, filled with stones heated outside and brought in. He wasn't aiming for warmth through fire. He was aiming for thermal regulation through heat management. Fires would still be lit, but always outside. Heat would be carried in, not created inside. Smoke, soot, heat loss, gone. In their place, a central heat battery that radiated gently over time, paired with passive airflow that would whisk away excess temperature when the seasons shifted. By February, the shell was finished. The ridge snowed heavy, but the new roof, double-pitched, vented at the crest with overlapping planks, shed the weight easily. Isaac slept inside for the first time on the last night of that month. The temperature outside hovered near zero. Inside, without a fire, he slept warm, not hot, not cold, just right. The air felt clean, dry, and most importantly, balanced. He could sense it in his lungs, the way breath moved slower, more easily. There was no stagnant pressure, no trapped humidity. It was the first time in years he hadn't woken at night needing to shift blankets, feed a fire, or wipe sweat from his neck. When the snow began to melt, others came. Not many at first, just men he knew, friends, or as close as trappers came to having them. Thomas Ray, a grizzled half-blood who'd survived a cougar attack 2 winters prior, arrived in late March. He'd heard from a French trader about the cool hut built into the rock. Isaac didn't answer questions this time. He just pointed. Let Thomas see for himself. The older man sat on the stone bench inside, his swollen knees propped up on a bark mat, and exhaled with something like reverence. "Feels like the earth's breathing," he said. By May, others followed. Word had spread across Fort Hall and the Green River trails. Some came politely, others not. One man, a tall trader with a New Orleans accent, offered Isaac $40 in gold for the design. Another brought whiskey and furs. Isaac turned them all away, not out of greed, but because something in him had shifted. This wasn't about trade anymore. It was about preservation. The mountains, in his mind, had given him something sacred. They'd taught him a system, a way of living in balance, not conquering nature, not hiding from it, but partnering with it, sharing breath with stone and wind and shade. And that wasn't something you sold, not to men who wanted to build inns or summer lodges or post signs offering cool rooms to travelers with coin. That spring, a company man came, clean coat, tall boots, surveyor's tools in a pack. Said he was with the American Fur Company, looking to build refined structures for the discerning traveler. He offered $50 just to sketch Isaac's chimneyless design. When Isaac refused, the man smiled politely and said he'd build it anyway. Said no law in the territory prevented a man from copying what he saw. He never made it back to St. Louis. The mountains did what Isaac wouldn't. A late storm came through the pass, hit the company man's camp while he was drawing diagrams. He and his 2 guides froze to death beneath a snapped tent pole. Their bodies were found 2 weeks later by a Mormon scout heading toward Oregon. Isaac never spoke about it, but that spring he built a second structure, smaller, tighter, just downslope from the main cabin. He called it a wind shelter, said it was for storing root vegetables. But inside, tucked beneath the floorboards, he buried the journal, the diagrams, the airflow charts, everything. Only 2 men knew it was there, because by then Isaac had made a decision. The knowledge wasn't going to be lost, but it wasn't going to be given freely anymore either. It had to be earned, through seasons, through failures, through frostbite and mold and spoiled meat. That was the only way men would treat it with the respect it deserved. So when trappers came now, Isaac didn't show them the design. He didn't open the floor or explain the venting shafts. He asked them questions. Where had they wintered? What had failed in their cabins? Did they notice airflow? Did they remember the direction of morning sun? Only if they answered with care, only if they'd already started to think like the mountain, would he bring them into the second cabin and let them sit in silence. No lessons, no lectures, just the experience, the cool air, the whisper of pine through hidden vents, the sense that, in that small space, a man could live without being at war with the world around him. That summer, a fire swept part of the valley. Lightning-struck pine on the far ridge sparked a blaze that ran fast and mean downwind. Isaac watched it from his roof. His old cabin caught. He saw the smoke rise, the glow in the dark. He didn't go back for it. He let it burn. When the fire died, he walked the 2 miles to see what remained. The cabin was gone, scorched clean. The stones cracked from heat. The roof collapsed. But something strange had happened. The trench, his first airflow experiment, still remained, half choked with ash, but intact. The rocks at the bottom were still cool to the touch. He knelt there, hand in the earth, and smiled, because the idea had outlived the house, just as it was meant to. The summer of 1840 arrived like a blow to the chest. The snowmelt barely had time to run before the heat settled back over the Wind River Valley like a smothering hand. But Isaac Coulter wasn't surprised. He'd watched the signs: early pollen, dry creek beds, birds nesting deeper under stone instead of in trees. When the last frost came in mid-May, 2 weeks early, he knew the season would come hard and fast. But this time he was ready. The new cabin, his final structure, held. That alone was proof the idea worked. Even in late June, when midday temperatures soared high enough to make bark split and horses sweat in the shade, Isaac's cabin remained cool. Not just tolerable, cool. Inside, the air was crisp and dry. Dampness never settled on his stores. Leather goods kept their shape. Food held longer than expected. The airflow system, driven by the thermal well buried in the north-facing rock, pulled heat away like an invisible river, a quiet draft slipping through vent stones and returning each room to calm. And yet, peace wouldn't last, because the heat didn't just test the cabin. It drove people, traders, travelers, drifters, families heading west for Oregon, and broken men coming back from it. The heat made them seek refuge, and when word spread of a trapper living in a cabin cooler than ice, even in the hottest months, they came. It started with a family. They arrived on a wagon choked with dust, eyes red from heat and smoke. A man, his wife, and 2 small boys. The youngest had a cough that never stopped, a deep bark Isaac recognized as the first sign of lung fever. They'd been traveling with a larger party, but split off when the woman collapsed 3 days south of the Bridger Trail. They didn't didn't ask to stay. They just stumbled in, dazed and desperate, and Isaac, despite his wariness, let them in. That night, they slept like stones. The boy's coughing slowed. The man wept once, quietly, into his hands. The woman didn't speak until morning. When she did, it was to say, "I forgot what silence feels like." Isaac said nothing, just set down a kettle, then slipped outside to sit on the stone shelf behind the cabin, watching the trees shift under the pressure of sun. They stayed 4 days. On the 5th, the father offered Isaac a silver coin with a hole punched through the middle. "For luck," he said, "and for keeping us alive." Isaac took it, said thank you, then buried the coin under a flat stone behind the wind shelter. That was how he measured gratitude, not in memory, but in weight left behind. But more came. A pair of trappers, lean, scar-faced men with the look of hard years and harder choices, showed up in early July. They were respectful but restless, asked too many questions. They were clearly there to learn, not just rest. One of them sketched diagrams when they thought Isaac wasn't looking. He said nothing, but later, when they were asleep, he checked their saddlebags, found charcoal drawings of the vent stones, the canopy structure, and a rough guess at the airflow trench. He burned the pages in his fire ring before dawn, said nothing the next morning, just gave them dry meat for the road and told them the wind was shifting west. They took the hint and left. The following week, an old Blackfoot woman came alone on foot. Her name was Akina. She said she had heard of a cabin that breathed like a stone lodge from the high plains, and she wanted to see if it was true. Isaac, intrigued and cautious, let her in. She didn't ask how it worked. She didn't draw diagrams. She just sat inside for hours, moving from wall to wall, touching each corner, then sitting again. When she left that night, she said only one thing: "You have found what the earth gives without asking." Isaac nodded. That was all, but not everyone came humbly. By mid-July, Isaac noticed tracks on the ridgeline, too many to be coincidence. Horses, heavy ones, wagons too. Something was coming. He suspected Redford, the trader who'd tried to buy his design the year before. That man hadn't given up. Isaac figured he'd return, not with coin this time, but with men. And he was right. They came on the 23rd of July. 6 riders, 1 wagon, Redford in front, clean coat, clean beard, a smirk carved into his face like it had been chiseled there. He dismounted like he owned the land. "Coulter," he said, "heard you built another one. This one's even better, so they say." Isaac didn't answer, just stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his hat pulled low. Redford gestured behind him. "Got a crew this time. Builder from St. Joe. A man with a compass and paper. We'd like to have a look around." Isaac didn't move. "No," Redford laughed. "No? You think you can hold off 6 men? I don't need to," Isaac said. "But the mountain might." Redford squinted. "You threatening me, Coulter?" "I don't threaten. I build, but I won't let you sell this." Redford's expression darkened. "You think you're the first man to find a trick with air and stone? You think you invented cool air? Hell, boy, I can buy smarter men than you and have them copy it by week's end. You're just in the way." Isaac stepped off the stoop and walked past Redford, not toward him but around him, toward the wagon. Inside rolled schematics, measuring rods, stakes, and ink pots. Isaac looked once, then said, "If you build this and sell it, the structure will fail. It won't be sacred. It'll be a trick. It'll burn. Or worse, it'll break." Redford snorted. "We'll see." They set up camp half a mile downwind. For 2 days, they surveyed, copied, and dug. Isaac watched from the tree line, said nothing. On the 3rd day, the wind changed. It started with heat, not from the sun, but from below, a pressure that built in the soil, dry as bone. The clouds vanished, the trees stilled. By evening, static clung to every surface, and the horizon glowed orange with tension. Isaac knew the signs. A storm was coming, not of water, of fire. The lightning struck just before midnight. One bolt, dead center into the south ridge. Dry pine exploded in flame. Wind caught it, carried it down slope, fast and cruel. Isaac didn't sleep. He stood on his roof, watched. It raced toward the camp, saw the sparks scatter like shotgun pellets into the clearing below. He considered warning them, but didn't, because some lessons were only learned through scars. The fire reached the camp just before dawn. Isaac watched from the high rock, saw the panic, the scramble, the ink pots shatter and scatter as men tripped over each other. The wagon burned first, then the half-dug trench. The builder's compass melted in the heat. Redford himself staggered from the flames, beard scorched, one hand blackened to the bone. He looked up toward Isaac's ridge and saw him standing there. Later, when the flames died, Isaac found only wreckage, no bodies, just charred tools, burned packs, and blackened papers. He took a single piece of scorched vellum from the ash, a partial diagram, the airflow channels, misdrawn, useless. He burned it again. Then he walked home. That night, he sat on the cold bench inside the stone cabin. The air was cool, silent, balanced. He didn't smile, but he didn't mourn either. He simply was. The next day, a girl arrived, 12 years old, barefoot, wrapped in deer hide. No parent, no name given. She said nothing, just stood at the door, eyes wide. Isaac let her in. She walked the space like she knew it already, sat near the stone wall, placed her hand on the vent stone. Then after an hour she whispered, "My mother died in the heat. We tried to find shade, but the trees burned." Isaac nodded, gave her bread, water, a cot. She stayed 3 days, then left. He never asked her name. She never returned. But the cot stayed, always clean, always made, because some visitors left without asking for anything but silence, and those were the ones Isaac remembered. By late August, the fire-scarred land began to heal. Green shoots pushed up through the ash. The ridge bloomed again, but the cabin, cool, quiet, hidden, remained untouched, because it had learned how to breathe. The next spring brought with it no fanfare, no great bloom of wild flowers or return of songbirds. The land had burned too hot the previous summer. What emerged instead was quieter, grasses creeping low and slow across the blackened valley, scattered pine saplings poking through fire-baked soil, and moss returning in patches on the shaded north faces of stone. It was a wounded place, healing in silence, and Isaac Coulter walked among it like a man tending a graveyard he refused to leave. He spoke less that spring, even to himself. The events of the previous year, the girl's quiet arrival and departure, Redford's greed-fueled attempt to copy the design, the fire that cleansed what Isaac wouldn't, had left him changed. Not hardened exactly, but pared down, like stone weathered smooth by a mountain stream, still solid, still cold, but less jagged. He no longer trusted men to leave well enough alone, and that meant the cabin, the idea, and all it represented had to be guarded differently now. He sealed the wind shelter where the journal had been hidden, took the bark-bound book, his lifetime of design notes, airflow calculations, sketches of vent stone arrangements, and moved it deeper, not just hidden beneath floorboards or behind stone. He buried it in a dry cave 2 ridges west, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed inside a hollowed cedar log, marked the place with nothing more than 3 stones in a triangle. No words, no signs, just instinct and memory. He told no one, and yet someone found him anyway. It was early June. The sun had risen hot again that year, cutting straight through the thin spring and pushing the last snowpack into the creeks by the first week. Isaac was checking the northern vent stones, clearing out winter's debris, pine needles, broken twigs, a layer of wind-blown dust, when he heard footsteps, not the loud crashing of a greenhorn, nor the thudding hooves of a mounted man. These were lighter, cautious, a single person on foot, moving with deliberate care. Isaac didn't reach for his rifle, just straightened, dusted his hands, and waited. From the tree line emerged a boy, tall for his age, maybe 15, but narrow in the shoulders and thin as a trapline hair, clothes patched with hide, boots worn nearly through, hair tied back with sinew, in a way that reminded Isaac of certain tribes he'd met along the green. The boy said nothing, just looked at the cabin, then at Isaac, then back at the cabin again. "You hungry?" Isaac asked. The boy nodded once. Isaac fed him. Rabbit stew, coarse bread, spring water. The boy ate without rushing but without pause. When the bowl was empty, he set it down with both hands, looked up, and said, "They said you keep summer in a box." Isaac raised an eyebrow. "They?" The boy shrugged. "Traders, trappers, a woman down the valley with a burned hand. She said she slept here once and dreamt of snow." Isaac said nothing, just refilled the boy's water. "I want to learn," the boy said. Isaac didn't answer. Instead, he stood, walked outside, and pointed to a stack of stones near the ridge. "Move those down to the shade shelf, flat side up." The boy did it. No complaints, no questions. It took him 4 hours. When he was done, Isaac gave him a mat and a blanket and let him sleep in the root cellar that doubled as a cool room in high summer. The next day, he asked the boy to dig a trench, not a big one, just enough to lay a practice airflow channel. The boy worked until his palms split, then bandaged them with moss and kept going. By the 3rd day, Isaac had said maybe 50 words to him, but the boy stayed. By the end of the week, he was still there, quiet, observant, listening more than speaking. At night, he sat by the outer stone shelf, carving notches into a piece of wood, counting something, or remembering. It was on the 10th day that Isaac asked, "What's your name?" The boy looked up. "Nathaniel, but they called me Nat." Isaac nodded. "And where's they now?" The boy's eyes dropped. "Gone. Fire took them." Isaac didn't ask more, just nodded again. After that, Nat stayed. They didn't talk about it, but the boy became a part of the routine. He learned quickly, not just the motions, but the reasons. He asked smart questions, and only after trying things first. He didn't draw diagrams, he didn't sketch to sell. He carved notches, built models in the dirt, tested vent stones with different angles, and brought in cool rocks each morning from the stream, just as Isaac had once done. He was learning not the design, but the thinking behind it, and that mattered more. One evening, late night in June, Isaac showed him the first trench, the old one, the one that had survived the fire, half buried in ash but still cool to the touch. Nat knelt beside it, ran his fingers along the edge. "This the start?" he asked. "No," Isaac said, "but it was the moment I realized the earth would help if I listened." They sat in silence after that. The cabin remained unchanged. The airflow continued to work, but something else began to shift inside its stone and wood walls. The presence of another, someone learning, caring, treating the space not as a curiosity but a living structure, began to open doors that Isaac had sealed for years. He began speaking more, explaining things, teaching not through orders but through questions. What happens to air when it's warmer inside than out? How does a vent change when shaded? Why are flat stones better than round for certain corners? Nat absorbed everything. He kept no journal. He needed none. His mind worked like Isaac's, watching, feeling, calculating without numbers. By the end of July, Isaac knew the cabin would outlive him, but only if someone truly understood it, not copied it, not mimicked its features. Understood. That night, as the sun dipped behind the burned ridge and the wind returned with the cool breath of stone and pine, Isaac handed Nat the oilskin roll. "My notes," he said. "Everything I thought before I knew better." Nat held it like a sacred thing. "Don't build from it," Isaac said. "Build from what you see, what you test, what you feel. Use it like the first trench, a beginning, nothing more." Nat nodded. 3 days later, Isaac fell sick. It started with a cough, dry, nothing serious. But by nightfall, he couldn't stand without shaking. Fever took him. Nat cooled his forehead with spring water, stoked the outer fire, brought in warm stones to chase off the chill. Isaac rallied the next day, stood briefly, tried to eat, then collapsed again. For 4 days, Nat tended to him. On the 5th, Isaac opened his eyes before dawn, looked at the vent stones, watched a moth drift lazily in the cool air, and whispered, "Feels like snow." Then he slept again. He didn't wake. Nat buried him beneath the cottonwoods, same as Isaac had done for his old dog years before. He marked the grave with 3 stones in a triangle, said, "Nothing." Then he cleaned the cabin, not scrubbed, not polished, cleaned the way a man resets a workshop, not the way he preserves a relic. He removed what he didn't need, left what mattered, adjusted the west vent slightly, replaced the shade cloth above the east canopy. He stayed for another month, alone, thinking. Then, one day, he packed a roll of hides, a bow drill, a skinning knife, and Isaac's oilskin journal, and he walked west. He didn't look back. But 2 days later, a young boy arrived in the valley, ragged, sunburned, carrying nothing. He found the cabin, slept on the stone shelf, ate wild onions from the edge of the stream. When he woke, he found a drawing carved into the entry post. 3 stones, a triangle. Below it, 2 words burned into the wood. "It breathes." The decades passed like snowfall, quiet, inevitable, burying all but the tallest stones and strongest names. By the time the transcontinental telegraph stretched wire across Wyoming in 1861, the name Isaac Coulter had faded from the tongues of traders and trappers. The old brigades were long gone, the beaver trade dead, the rivers no longer lined with trap lines and canvas tents. Men didn't come west chasing pelts anymore. They came with maps, with law books, with rail iron and fence wire and deeds pressed with government stamps. But some names didn't die. They sank, settled, took root, and in the high valleys east of the Wind River Range, Coulter's cabin became a whisper. By then, the structure was over 20 years old, but it hadn't collapsed. It hadn't been scavenged for timber or stripped of stone. It stood, weathered but whole, in a shaded bend below a sandstone rise, nestled in the arms of pine and rock, as if the land itself was reluctant to let it go. Travelers who stumbled across it, most by accident, a few by rumor, told strange stories. That it was always cool inside, even when the sun scorched the sky. That animals didn't go near it, but birds sang louder around it. That rain never soaked the floor. That the air inside never smelled of age or dust or rot, only stone and bark and stillness. Some tried to camp inside. One surveyor, lost during the Fremont expedition, wrote in his journal that he found shelter in an unnatural cabin of superior make, cooler than the mountain night, and more still than any church. He stayed 2 days, then moved on. He died that winter in the pass. His journal was recovered later. The entry about the cabin was copied and passed among other men. That was how the legend spread. They started calling it the Cold House. Some said it had been built by native spirits. Others claimed a French hermit had carved it out of the mountain by hand. A few told wild tales of a lost tribe that lived beneath the hills and funneled the chill of the earth through hidden vents. No 2 stories matched, but all agreed on one point. The cabin was wrong in a way that felt right, an inversion of everything. They knew about shelter in the wild. It kept cool without ice, comfort without smoke, and balance without effort. That contradiction made it sacred, and so it was left alone. By 1870, the region saw more settlers, ranches, outposts, survey crews. A few tried to find the cabin on purpose, but most failed. The forest had shifted again. Fires had scarred paths. Rains had altered creek beds, and the trails Isaac once knew by feel had faded. Even Nat, if he was still alive, didn't return. But every 5 years or so, someone found the place, left a mark, a token, a note carved into the post, a name etched into stone. By 1877, there were 8 marks on the outer beam, each simple, a triangle of 3 stones, sometimes carved, sometimes burned, no words, just the symbol. That same year, a geologist named Merrick Hardin, educated in Boston, eager for glory, passed through the Wind River Basin on a private mapping expedition. He heard the tale of the cold house from an old guide who swore he'd seen it once as a boy but never again. Hardin, driven by a need to classify and control, made it his mission to find it. He did. It took him 11 days of backtracking, compass checking, and interviewing locals who barely remembered their own father's names. When he arrived at the cabin, he expected ruin. He found the opposite. The roof was intact, the stone still cool, the vent channels clear. Despite 2 decades of weather and growth, the interior was sparse. Just a cot, a stone bench, and a flat hearth. But it felt more alive than any structure he'd ever studied. He lit no fire. He opened no journal. He just sat, for hours, watching the way light moved through the gaps, feeling the air shift, as if drawn from deeper than the mountain itself. Hardin didn't sleep that night, not out of fear but respect. He sensed the structure wasn't meant for him, that it belonged to another rhythm, one older than science, but no less precise. In his notes he wrote only, "The air moves but no wind. The stone breathes but no breath. It exists, therefore it remains." He marked the cabin on a private map, but never published it. He feared what men would do with it, and he was right to, because not all men feared mystery. In 1882, an engineer named Lucas Price arrived in the region. He'd heard the stories. Unlike Hardin, Price saw opportunity. He'd worked on cooling systems for railway ice cars, knew about airflow, insulation, temperature differentials. He thought he could reverse engineer the cold house, turn it into something marketable, a new kind of summer lodge, a chain maybe, cooling without ice. He found the cabin. He measured, he charted, he poked holes in the vent stones, dislodged moss, dug beneath the floorboards, searching for hidden reservoirs or ducts. What he found was confusing. There was no reservoir, no buried tank of spring water, no chemical treatment of the walls, just layers of design, interlocking systems of shade, airflow, thermal mass, and earth coupling, passive mechanisms, old as the world itself. But still, he thought, he could replicate it, so he tried. Price built 3 models, one in Idaho, one in Colorado, one in Utah. He called them summer cabins of the future. He used local stone, copied the vent patterns, even tried to mimic the terrain, but none of them worked. At best, they stayed slightly cooler than ambient temperature. At worst, they trapped heat like ovens. He blamed materials, then shape, then superstition. By 1885, the venture had failed. Investors pulled out. Price moved east, bitter and confused. But in the journals of one of his foremen, a quiet man named Garth Miller, there was a different observation. He wrote, "The problem is not the cabin, it's us. We build fast, we build for profit." Coulter, he built with purpose, with patience, with solitude, and maybe that's what made it work. Garth never built another cabin. He returned to Wyoming, settled near the Wind River Basin, and became a guide. Every so often, he took a traveler up the ridge, never said why. By the time the 20th century arrived, the cold house had become more myth than memory. Maps didn't show it. Guidebooks ignored it. The railroad never reached that bend in the range. Only the oldest families spoke of it, and even then, only around firelight, in the kind of voice used for prayer or warnings. But still, it stood. Because Isaac hadn't built it to be found. He'd built it to endure. And in the summer of 1903, a young boy named Thomas, just 12, would stumble across the cabin while chasing a wounded deer. He'd crawl beneath the moss-covered shelf, find the doorway half hidden by brush, and step into coolness so profound he'd gasp. He wouldn't speak for hours. He'd sit on the stone bench, feel the draft against his skin, smell earth and pine and stillness. And when he left, he'd place 3 stones in a triangle. He wouldn't know why, but he'd feel it was right. The cold house had outlived its maker, its century, and the trade that birthed it. It outlived the railroads and the beaver hats, and the belief that wilderness could be conquered by men with wagons and dreams. It stood through wars, through treaties broken and rewritten, through the rise of smokestack cities and the vanishing of the last old-growth forests east of the Mississippi. It endured because it had been built with no ambition to outlive anything. It had simply been built right, and in doing so, it survived. In the spring of 1922, after an unusually dry winter, a man named Elias King came into the valley. He wasn't a trapper, not a rancher, not even a hiker. in the way the new century defined them. He was a stonemason from Illinois, 63 years old, recently widowed and walking west for reasons he couldn't quite name. He'd sold his home, his tools, and most of his possessions, and for 6 months had been moving toward the setting sun, stopping only when he felt something unfamiliar, ease. When Elias found the cold house, he was near death. He'd run out of supplies 3 days earlier, lost his pack trying to cross a swollen stream, and been following game trails hoping they led anywhere. What he saw, when he came through the pine curtain into the shaded clearing, made him stop like he'd reached the edge of a painting. A shape too clean for nature, too settled for recent hands. Not grand, not majestic, just fitting, like a stone where it belonged. He entered through the low doorframe, his boots dragging, ribs visible beneath a torn shirt. The air inside made him gasp. Cool, dry, not stale. It was the first breath he'd taken in weeks that didn't taste like struggle. He slept there for 2 days, rising only to drink from the spring and eat what berries he could gather. On the 3rd day, he sat in the center of the cabin and whispered, "How did you do it?" He wasn't expecting an answer, but he got one. Not in words, not in visions, just a feeling, a kind of presence, the hush of balance. The whisper of air shifting through vents that had been laid not just with stone, but with understanding, a system not designed by mathematics, but by intuition refined through hunger and solitude and grief, a structure that did not fight nature but danced with it. Elias, a mason who'd laid his first bricks when Lincoln still breathed, recognized what he was seeing. This cabin hadn't been made, it had been listened to. He stayed through summer, through fall, repaired nothing, because nothing needed it. The cold house didn't require upkeep so much as partnership. When storms came, he braced the east vent with fresh moss. When the airflow shifted, he opened the roof flap a little wider. He swept, he gathered wood, he watched, and he read the marks. By then there were dozens, some carved, some scratched, a few stained by soot and age. Always the same, 3 stones, a triangle, sometimes accompanied by a date, 1868, 1885, 1903. The most recent was only 4 years old, 1918. Beneath it a name, J. Sutter. Elias added his own, not carved into the cabin, but into the bark of a pine just beyond the clearing. He used his chisel. The letters were slow and deep. EK 1922, found peace where breath stays cool. When the first snowfall came in October, he built a small cairn on the ridge overlooking the roof. Just 5 stones, stacked by instinct. No message, no map, just memory. Elias died the following spring, not inside the cabin, but beside the stream, sitting on a flat rock with his boots still laced and his hands folded in his lap. The forest took him gently. Pine needles drifted over his shoulders. His body didn't rot quickly. The air was too dry, the shade too constant. When a boy from the nearby town of Dubois found him in August, the cold house was still clean, still cool, still untouched. The boy was 16, chasing a wounded elk that had bolted down into the shaded valley. He'd expected nothing, certainly not a stone and log structure standing upright in a place where no roads reached. When he entered, he thought it was abandoned. Then he saw the stone benches, the cot, the vent shafts, and on the hearth, a small wooden carving, a triangle, burnished by time. The boy returned 2 weeks later, this time with his father, a quiet man, a rancher, who said little as he walked through the cabin. He touched the walls, felt the air, knelt to see the vent stones. He didn't ask who built it, he just nodded. "Leave it," he told his son, and they did. But every year after that, they returned once, in late summer, bringing a small bag of dried meat, a jar of wild honey, and a pine bough. They left the offerings on the stone shelf, said nothing, took nothing. By 1930, the cold house was known only to a handful of families in the area, men who'd been guided there by fathers or uncles, always with a warning. Don't talk about it, don't try to fix it, don't take anything out. It became a rite of passage for some, a secret for others, a place where boys became quiet and quiet boys became men, the kind of place that demanded stillness. But the outside world continued to grow louder. In 1945, a surveyor working for the U.S. Forest Service marked the region for possible development, a ranger station or lookout tower. His notes included a curious phrase, unusual structure found, possibly old mining outpost or early homestead, interior unnaturally cool, recommend further inspection. That note found its way to an office in Laramie, where it was filed, then forgotten. But in 1964, a different kind of man came. Dr. Gregory Renner, professor of environmental architecture at the University of Colorado, was researching pre-modern cooling systems in indigenous and frontier structures. He'd come across a footnote in a 1919 journal describing a cold house in the Wind River Basin, possibly built by a trapper, functioning without chimney, fireplace, or known air system. Intrigued, he organized a solo expedition and after weeks of searching found the cabin. He stayed inside for 2 days, made no drawings, took no samples. But when he returned to Boulder, he added a new lecture to his summer course titled The Breadth of Structures, Passive Design, and Forgotten Wisdom. He never named the cold house, but his students remembered. One of them, a man named Thomas Reyes, would later help design the passive airflow systems used in high-altitude research stations across the Rockies. Another, Elaine Morell, became a pioneer in subterranean cooling for desert homes. Neither of them saw the cabin, but they carried it in every design they ever made. In this way, the cold house spread, not through blueprints or patents, but through influence. A whisper in the hands of those who understood that sometimes the best solutions weren't invented. They were discovered. And now, it still stands, hidden but not lost, weathered but intact. There are no signs, no trails, no fences, only 3 stones stacked at the edge of a shadow, marking a place where breath moves in silence and the air stays cool even as the world burns. They say sometimes, on the hottest days of the year, when the sun hangs like a weight and even the wind refuses to stir, you can still walk into that shaded clearing and feel the air change. Feel it slide across your skin like a memory of something older than pain, older than sweat, older than fear. And if you sit quietly on the stone bench, you might hear it. Not a voice, not a wind, just a breath. The breath of a cabin that was never meant to impress, only to work. The breath of a man who built not to sell, not to last, but to survive. The breath of earth, channeled through wood and rock and ash, remembered only by those wise enough to sit and listen. And if you do, leave a mark, 3 stones, a triangle, then walk away. The cold house doesn't need guardians. It is the guardian.